Welcome to Global 24, your trusted source for breaking news, deep insights, and stories shaping Africa and the world. Stay informed, stay connected, and experience the news that matters. Right here, 24/7. In the early decades of the 21st century, a quiet but powerful realignment began to unfold across the global south. Once described as developing or dependent, these regions, led by China, India, and a rapidly awakening Africa, are now crafting an economic alliance that could redefine the balance of global power. This is not a story of conflict or ideology, but of numbers, of trade routes, infrastructure, and sheer economic potential that no longer bends to Western dominance. At the heart of this transformation lies a vision, a new trade bloc connecting over 4 billion people, commanding vast reserves of minerals, manufacturing power, and energy potential. Together, these nations are rewriting the rules of global commerce, not through confrontation, but through collaboration. And in capitals from Washington to Brussels, concern is rapidly turning into alarm. For decades, the West dominated international trade, dictating terms through institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and WTO. African economies were forced into unequal partnerships, their raw materials exported cheaply while finished goods returned at a premium. China and India, once on the periphery of this order, now stand as alternatives. China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, has invested over $1 trillion in infrastructure across Asia and Africa. India, through the India-Africa Forum Summit, has deepened ties in technology, pharmaceuticals, and agriculture. But something new is taking shape. A coordinated framework linking Asian industrial power with African resources and markets. In recent months, high-level discussions between the African Union, China's Ministry of Commerce, and India's Ministry of External Affairs have signaled a common goal: to form a trade corridor independent of Western financial systems and shipping monopolies. This is not speculation. It is happening, port by port, rail by rail, and policy by policy. The implications are enormous. Africa possesses 60% of the world's arable land, 30% of global mineral reserves, and a youth population larger than Europe and North America combined. India brings technological and pharmaceutical expertise, while China contributes industrial scale and financial capital. Combined, they represent the largest human and economic potential ever assembled outside the Western orbit. Trade between the three has surged by over 700% in the last 2 decades, according to the African Development Bank. But the next phase goes further: direct settlement of trade in local currencies, bypassing the US dollar entirely. Already, China is finalizing yuan-based trade agreements with several African states, while India promotes the rupee as a regional exchange medium. The move signals not only a new economic era, but a quiet challenge to the global financial hierarchy established after World War II. For Africa, this alliance is not about rejecting the West, it's about rebalancing power. After centuries of extraction and one-sided deals, leaders from Burkina Faso to Kenya, from Egypt to South Africa, are now demanding a seat at the table of global trade on their own terms. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, launched in 2021, laid the groundwork for this vision: a single African market of 1.4 billion people. By aligning with China and India, Africa seeks to transform that market into a manufacturing and export hub capable of supplying the world, not merely serving it. This is why Western analysts are worried. If Africa becomes a co-equal partner in an Asia-Africa trade bloc, Western companies could lose their monopoly over resource extraction and industrial contracts. In short, the global South would finally own the means of its own production. Observers describe this emerging alliance as the new Silk Road meets the new Africa rising. Across the continent, ports in Djibouti, Mombasa, Lagos, and Durban are being expanded with Chinese investment, while Indian companies are building technology parks and pharmaceutical plants in Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Rwanda. The result is a web of cooperation stretching from Shanghai to New Delhi to Accra, a system designed to serve mutual development rather than dependency. Critics in the West call it economic colonization. But in African capitals, many view it differently. As a necessary diversification of partnerships, an end to being forced to choose between aid and autonomy. This alignment, African economists argue, is driven not by ideology, but by pragmatism. China wants markets for its products and security for its investments. India wants access to Africa's raw materials and cooperation in technology. Africa wants infrastructure, jobs, and self-determination. Together, they form a triangle of interdependence, one that is shifting the center of gravity in world trade from the North Atlantic to the global South. For Western powers, the challenge is profound. As the U.S. Federal Reserve tightens monetary policy and Europe battles inflation, nations across Africa are beginning to trade in alternative payment systems linked to Asian partners. From digital banking in Kenya to blockchain-based trade settlements in Nigeria, financial innovation is accelerating faster outside Western frameworks than within them. And every new agreement, every rail line, power grid, and logistics corridor financed by Asia further reduces the West's leverage over African economies. Yet, the true power of this alliance is not just economic. It is symbolic. For the first time since the end of colonial rule, Africa is shaping its partnerships from a position of strength, negotiating with equals, not benefactors. This is the essence of what some analysts call the multipolar decade. As the story unfolds, one question looms. Is this the dawn of a new global order, or simply a rebalancing of an old one? For the West, the rise of a China, India, Africa trade bloc represents a strategic nightmare, a world where power no longer flows from Washington or Brussels, but from Addis Ababa, Beijing, and New Delhi. For Africa, it may finally be the long-awaited opportunity to convert potential into prosperity. The continent that once supplied the world's raw materials may soon be supplying its finished goods, powered by partnerships it chose for itself. The shift has already begun, and the world, particularly the West, is watching. In a rapidly shifting world order, where alliances fracture and economies realign, three regions once described as developing are quietly rewriting the rules of global power. China, India, and Africa, once at the margins of international trade, are converging to form an unprecedented economic alliance. An alliance that could change everything about how the world trades, invests, and grows. For the first time in modern history, the center of gravity in global economics may be moving decisively southward, away from the North Atlantic and toward the global South. The West is watching closely, and many are not comfortable with what they see. For decades, the global trade system was defined by Western control. The institutions of power, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, all operated under frameworks written in Washington, London, and Brussels. African nations were mostly consumers and exporters of raw materials. China and India, while rising, still depended on Western markets for much of their manufacturing and financial liquidity. But that era is ending. Today, new corridors of commerce are emerging. Ports and railways stretch across Africa, financed not by Europe or the United States, but by partners in Beijing and New Delhi. Across the Indian Ocean, ships move not just goods, but ideas, from African raw materials to Asian factories, and from Asian innovations back to African consumers. This is the new Silk Road, rebuilt for the 21st century, and it is connecting 4 billion people into a single web of interdependence. To understand the scale of what's happening, consider this. Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 60% of its arable land, and a youth population larger than the entire population of Europe. China remains the world's manufacturing hub, with unmatched industrial capacity and investment power. India, the world's fastest-growing major economy, contributes advanced technology, pharmaceuticals, and a growing consumer base of over 1.4 billion people. Together, they represent more than half of the global population and nearly one-third of global GDP. But beyond numbers, they represent something deeper, a shared ambition to shape the next global order on their own terms. The roots of this partnership can be traced to decades of quiet diplomacy. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, poured billions into roads, ports, power plants, and digital networks across Africa. India, through the India-Africa Forum Summit and growing bilateral trade missions, expanded its footprint in healthcare, agriculture, and renewable energy. Africa, uniting under the African Continental Free Trade Area, began to speak with one voice, a voice demanding partnership, not patronage. These three movements, China's infrastructure push, India's tech diplomacy, and Africa's economic unification are now converging. The result is a new trade bloc, one that doesn't yet have a formal name, but already has unmistakable influence. It is a bloc built not on ideology, but on practicality. A network of economies seeking growth through cooperation, not confrontation. In recent years, trade between China, India, and Africa has exploded. China-Africa trade reached $282 billion in 2023. India-Africa trade stood at $98 billion, rising steadily each year. But these figures tell only part of the story. The deeper shift lies in how these trades are being conducted. African nations are increasingly settling transactions in local currencies, bypassing the U.S. dollar. China and India are both promoting alternatives, the yuan and the rupee, as stable mediums of exchange for South-South trade. In parallel, Africa is developing regional payment systems under the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS, allowing cross-border transactions in African currencies. Together, these changes threaten one of the West's most powerful tools, the dominance of the dollar in global trade. The implications are historic. For over 70 years, the dollar has been the backbone of international commerce, giving the United States immense leverage over global economics. But in recent years, that dominance has begun to erode. With each new trade deal signed in local currencies, with each infrastructure project financed outside Western banks, the world moves a little closer to a multipolar financial system. To many in Africa, this isn't just economics, it's sovereignty. It's the ability to decide what to sell, to whom, and on what terms. From the copper mines of Zambia to the rail lines of Kenya, from the solar farms of Egypt to the industrial parks of Nigeria, a quiet revolution is unfolding, one built on self-determination through partnership. For the West, this rise of a global South trade axis presents both a challenge and a reckoning. The fear isn't just about losing markets, it's about losing control. If Africa can trade freely with Asia on equal terms, the entire foundation of Western leverage, from aid conditions to resource pricing, begins to crumble. Western analysts have described the trend as the fragmentation of globalization. But in African policy circles, it's seen differently, not as fragmentation, but as correction. For too long, Africa's role in the global economy was predetermined, supplier of raw materials, buyer of finished goods. Now, through alliances with China and India, that narrative is shifting toward industrialization, value addition, and regional integration. In other words, Africa is no longer content to play the supporting role in someone else's economy. Across the continent, this shift is visible in every major sector. In Kenya, Chinese-built industrial zones are now producing consumer electronics for African markets. In Nigeria, Indian pharmaceutical firms have established local manufacturing plants that reduce reliance on imports. In Ethiopia, a new rail line built with Chinese financing and Indian engineering connects Addis Ababa to Djibouti, reducing shipping time by over 70%. These are not isolated projects. They are pieces of a vast, interlocking puzzle, a design for a new kind of globalization where Africa is at the center, not the edge. And while Western commentators often frame this as China's expansion or India's influence, African leaders increasingly describe it as strategic diversification, a deliberate move to balance relationships, to escape dependency on any single global power. One of the defining features of this emerging bloc is the concept of shared development. China offers loans and technical expertise in exchange for access to resources and markets. India provides knowledge transfer, digital infrastructure, and joint ventures in agriculture and manufacturing. Africa, in return, supplies both the raw materials and the human capital that fuel production. It's an exchange built on interdependence, not on control. Critics argue that this still risks new forms of dependency. But African economists counter that the difference lies in agency. This time, African states are negotiating from a position of choice, not coercion. As one African trade official recently stated, "We are not choosing between the West and the East. We are choosing ourselves and deciding who we work with on our own terms." Behind the scenes, the pace of institutional cooperation is accelerating. The BRICS alliance, now expanded to include Egypt and Ethiopia, offers Africa greater access to alternative financing. Joint investment funds between Chinese and African development banks are channeling billions into renewable energy and industrial processing zones. India's Exim Bank has opened new credit lines for African businesses seeking to export value-added goods, not just raw commodities. Meanwhile, discussions around a tricontinental logistics corridor connecting African ports to Indian and Chinese markets via digital and maritime routes have already begun. For the first time, Africa is not being connected to the world as an appendage of colonial trade, but as an active participant in global supply chains. As the trade bloc gains strength, the geopolitical implications deepen. Washington, London, and Paris view this cooperation with increasing anxiety. In think tanks and foreign ministries across the West, analysts warn of a strategic loss of influence in Africa. But within Africa, a different narrative is emerging, one rooted in optimism. African governments see in this moment a chance to break from decades of economic imbalance and to redefine what partnership truly means. In the words of a senior official from the African Union, our aim is not to isolate the West. It is to build a world where Africa has options, where no single power can dictate our future. The shift is not without challenges. Africa must navigate debt sustainability, ensure fair contracts, and build governance frameworks strong enough to handle its growing economic weight. India and China must manage their own rivalry while cooperating in shared African ventures. And the West must come to terms with a future in which it is no longer the sole architect of global trade. Yet, the direction of change seems irreversible. The next century, many analysts believe, will be defined not by East versus West, but by the rise of the South. In that world, Africa will no longer be the resource frontier of others, but a cornerstone of its own destiny, linking Asia's factories, Latin America's commodities, and Europe's markets through African-led initiatives and infrastructure. At its core, this is a story of transformation. A continent long viewed through the lens of poverty and dependence is now emerging as a central pillar of the global economy. China and India, once themselves marginalized by colonialism, have become partners in that transformation. Together, they are building something far larger than trade, a model for how the global South can rise without permission. From the industrial parks of Addis Ababa to the ports of Mombasa, from solar fields in Morocco to digital corridors in Lagos, a new future is being wired, paved, and negotiated into existence. And for the first time in centuries, Africa stands not as a follower of global trends, but as a driver of them. The West may view this with apprehension, but for Africa, the message is clear. The era of dependency is over. The era of partnership has begun. This is the dawn of a new trade world, one built not on dominance, but on connection. And as Africa, China, and India continue to forge this path, the rest of the world will have no choice but to adjust. Because the future of global trade no longer runs only through New York or London. It now runs through Nairobi, Mumbai, and Beijing. And that, perhaps, is what truly terrifies the West. You've been watching Afro Global 24, your window into Africa and the world. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest stories shaping our continent and beyond. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a report. And join the conversation in the comments below. Until next time, this is Afro Global 24, bringing Africa closer to the globe 24 hours a day.